But I never had that into the story. I've never had this conversation.
I'm going to interrupt the good conversation. I'm going to introduce Mattison Hale. We know Mattison because many of you are familiar with Chesterton Academy. About a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years, we were looking for good faculty to bring to Chesterton. And you must have seen a job posting or maybe, and you knew the area because Father Walter, who many of you here know, you took classes with him in Boston, but he was in seminary in St. John's. And so we were very impressed with Mattison's experience, with his training. We had conversations with him over Zoom. You haven't been able to make it a reality to bring him to Rochester, but finally he's here, so he gets to see what Rochester is about. Going around. Jim just joined. Jim, I'm going to mute you. And so he's been going around. He gave a talk earlier this morning to the students at Chesterton. We took him to Genesee Brew House on recommendation of somebody undisclosed to see the falls. Yes, it was a good choice. Thank you, Father Motel. Showed him some burgers. Matthew Pooner got to talk to him a little bit, showed him around. And now he's here under the auspices of Aquinas Institute to close our seminar on beauty. This is the fourth lecture this academic year. We got 2 in the fall. This is the second one in the spring. Last one we were in this room, was it 2 months ago? Alicia? It was
February.
What?
No, ACS night of the year.
It feels years ago. On beauty, and he's going to finish today the seminars, this particular set of seminars on beauty, by telling us what Thomas Aquinas thought of beauty, to some degree at least. He studied his master's in theology in Boston College, and he's been teaching in Michigan for a few years now in a high school run by Regan Christie. And again, we're trying to convince him that Rochester is a good place. And now we're going to see what he has to say. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Antivros. Thank you to the Agathon Institute for covering such a timeless and important topic, a large abstract topic perhaps, but one that needs constant revisiting from us. And one of my favorite thinkers of all time is, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas. Who doesn't love St. Thomas Aquinas? And so I thought when Dr. Antivros mentioned that the Agathon Institute was running a seminar on beauty, I thought, well, I think that would be fascinating to look at what St. Thomas Aquinas thought about beauty. Now, I have to confess right up front that some of you may know that St. Thomas doesn't have a systematic aesthetic. He doesn't write a treatise called On Beauty, but many contemporary and modern Thomists believe that we found enough in Thomas to support a realist aesthetic. That is one that believes that beauty is a real thing out there in the world, which when you start talking about beauty and you use words like objective and real and out there in the world, that always raises some academic interest and some cultural conversations. And so I thought, well, what better way to meet with you guys tonight than to discuss St. Thomas Aquinas. So I've just entitled this lecture, Beauty in a Fallen World, St. Thomas Aquinas on Beauty as Transcendental. It is no great groundbreaking novelty among medievalists to locate the remedy for some modern problem in an authority from the past. Perhaps this is because we suspect that the careful realism of medieval philosophy contains wisdom that persists, obscured perhaps, but never totally eclipsed by modern philosophy, offering something of perennial value. This is certainly my position as it regards St. Thomas Aquinas and his insights into the metaphysics of the beautiful. We do not need to launch into a full-scale attack on modern art or literature or architecture here. I think it will be easy enough as we review this metaphysics of St. Thomas tonight to realize that the scholastic aesthetic included vital insights into the nature of the beautiful that are worth recovering in modernity, and how critical a task this is. It seems that in times of fear or confusion, the appreciation of beauty is sometimes the first thing to fall by the wayside. This is far from a dispensable ornament or a garnish among the real stuff of life. Indeed, the Catholic Church has long held that beauty is an objective and necessary part of creation and the human experience of it. As Pope VI wrote in his letter to artists in 1963, this world in which we live needs beauty in order not to sink into despair. It is beauty like truth which brings joy to the heart of man. And is the precious fruit which resists the wear and tear of time, makes them share things in admiration. But what is at stake then in a right understanding of the beautiful is not merely an airy aestheticism for academics to savor only among themselves. No, St. Thomas Aquinas offers a metaphysical vision that begins at the ground level of experience and rises to illuminate every aspect of human life. He's right. Then the beautiful is not only found where we might typically suspect, the serenity of nature or the attractiveness of the human form or even the music of Bach, but permeates every real being per se. For Aquinas, even in a world marred by the ugliness of sin, the ontological splendor of God's creation shines through the darkness. And so in order to interpret St. Thomas Aquinas rightly on beauty, we should probably first acquaint ourselves with metaphysics itself and his doctrine of the transcendentia, or the transcendentals. So just a brief review of those two things will help us to set the table for discussion of beauty. The medieval aesthetic envisioned all of creation as integrated, with all real beings interrelated to one another by virtue of having been made by God. This great chain of being was foundational to the metaphysical philosophy, which is the study of being or existence as such. Such a study may seem like an ivory tower for the few, but it is in fact precisely the opposite. Metaphysical questions are the most essential and acute of all human experience, and are asked and answered by everyone, whether they realize it or not. When anyone seeks out the meaning of things, or asks why there is something rather than nothing, she's doing metaphysics. When solemn death confronts a person with the mystery of life and of suffering simultaneously in the world, when he grasps at the very nature of reality and asks what sort of a place this is, he's doing metaphysics. Metaphysics is the science and study of being itself, of all that is real. It is an attempt to say something authentic about all of reality at once. Accordingly, St. Thomas's transcendentia are appellations that describe all real beings from insects to angels to God himself. The transcendentals are called so because they cross all boundaries, and although conceptually distinct from one another, are each coextensive with being. They cannot add to being, since outside of existence is only non-existence. But they explain a, quote, modus generalis consequens omne ens, which is a general mode following all of being. In short, the transcendentals refer to the same reality, but in different ways. If beauty belongs among these transcendentia, then the grandeur of the universe is not merely a poetic flight of fancy, but a fundamental quality of all that is real. To determine why St. Thomas finds this to be true, let us briefly review all of the other transcendentals that he names. There are 4. First, activity. Let's start with a very simple question. What is the primary aspect of reality itself? Okay, that doesn't sound very simple. What does it mean for a thing to be real? What is the distinction that we can make between what is real and what isn't? Quite simply, Aquinas teaches we make this distinction by asking whether or not a being acts or has an effect on the world. Real beings are those that make themselves known by acting, by affecting other real beings. A thought experiment will illustrate this nicely. Let us try together to imagine a real being, but one that does not have any effect on anything else in the world. Now, of course, our imaginary being will be invisible, but it also takes up no space, it emits no radiation, it is totally intangible, it has no weight, etc. The more specifically our imaginations try to conjure this inactive being, this being that doesn't have an effect on the world. And we're really just adding negative qualities, aren't we? We're saying what it isn't. We're saying it isn't this, it isn't that. The more it becomes clear to us that this being is definitionally equal to nothing. If having no effect on the world is equivalent to non-existence, and it seems that it is, then St. Thomas's placing of activity as the first transcendental is correct. In fact, it's necessary, and all of us need to understand this transcendental, because it isn't telling the difference between what is real and what is not, after all, the first mark of knowing truth or of sanity. Let's consider another example. Imagine a child, is my favorite example of this. Imagine a child who wakes up from a dream, crying, screaming in the next room, claiming, "Mommy, Daddy, there's an alligator under my bed." Ah. Well, what does the parent do? I don't know about your parents. What do my parents do? They come into the room. Oh, thank goodness the child's not joking to death or something. Okay, it's just a dream. So what do? They look under the bed. They lift the blankets and look under the bed. A particularly well-meaning parent may even reach his or her hand under the bed and pat around, demonstrating that there is in fact no alligator. Now, whether or not there is an alligator there, the ontology or the being, the existence of this alligator, that's going to become known pretty quickly. And that knowledge will depend on whether there is any creature that affects the searching parent. In fact, that's what the parent is going to say. If there is nothing there, he will say, "Don't worry, son, nothing there. It can't hurt you. It can't affect you." And so the parent demonstrates this to the child. I mean, my mother probably made me get down, look under the bed myself. Okay, now the child has seen there's nothing there that affects the world. Nothing acting underneath it. Now, of course, if there truly is an alligator present, then the parent will be affected very quickly and can even come to know something about the nature of alligatorness based on the effect that this alligator, oh, this is a creature that bites. Now I understand something new. So this leads us to another interesting classic Thomas maxim, agere sequitur esse, which means action follows being. In other words, we can really know something about real beings by the actions or the effects that they have. That alligator probably doesn't think of himself as self-revelating during the bite, but that is precisely what he's doing. So action as the first transcendental makes a lot of sense. It's an effect. And of course, all beings act analogously. A hydrogen molecule will act in a different way than your cat will act. And of course, the most obvious self-presenters in the world are us rational creatures who not only present ourselves, but we know what we're doing and we want others to know what we're doing as well. So ground level distinction between the real and the non-real, the sane and the insane, a reality that is authentic and true and conforms to this world versus one that exists only in the minds or imaginations of thinking minds. Well, that grounding distinctor is action for St. Thomas. All right, first transcendental has been laid. His second transcendental is unity or oneness. Every being, he writes, insofar as it is a real being, is singular, is a real being. Let's take some careful thought. It's quite interesting. Real beings, although they may be composed of parts like leaves or livers or minds, act from a single unified center of action. Now, this is a logical, not a scientific point that St. Thomas reaches by negative proof. So if you will indulge in another thought experiment, let's entertain Aquinas on yet another one of these journeys. He does this by a negative proof. He says, okay, either all real beings are one being, not the same being, but are one and of themselves, or every real being is many beings really put together. As Carl Sagan famously said, I am nothing more than a cluster of atoms bearing the name Carl Sagan. Well, that would be the opposite of St. Thomas's view. That would be a reductionist view of everything is really only whatever its smallest parts are. Well, let's think carefully together. If that were true, then each one of those parts would itself not be a real being, would itself not be singular, but plural. We would need to say that each part was not a being, but many beings, and reduce them yet again. So our minds couldn't even lock on, if you will, to any particular being at this or that moment, but only a indistinct cluster of thises and that's. And as soon as we start to contemplate each one of those, they break down immediately, because every being would have to be many beings if we take this contrary hypothesis to St. Thomas's. Father W. Norris Clark, the great late Thomist, called this negative thought experiment infinite dust. He says, as we continue to reduce and reduce and reduce, so a human being is nothing but organs, which are nothing but cells, which are nothing but proteins, which are nothing but molecules, whatever, we want to keep going and going and going, we will quickly end up with no beings at all, because we have no way to draw a non-arbitrary line which says, okay, this is now a singular being. It must be that St. Thomas's original distinction is true. Either all things are one being, you stop at the beginning and you take a human or a cat or a dandelion to be a real being, or you end up with multiplicity that leads into the definition, once again, close to nothingness. So we must note also here, before we move on, though, that what it does not mean is that every being is indivisible. It's easy enough to pluck that dandelion's flower or cut out a liver. I mean, that's possible. Not indivisible, but that currently every real being is a real being acting from a unified center, acting from a center of action as a unified whole. This ontological unity of internal cohesion has to apply to everything in existence in order for it to exist at all. And therefore, Thomas says, this quality of unity, oneness, is transcendental. Thirdly, truth. Well, verum, as St. Thomas called it. Well, most of us probably use truth to describe whether our thoughts or statements themselves correspond to reality. St. Thomas Aquinas noticed that human knowledge and speech themselves would be impossible if not for some quality in reality itself, making being open to mind. That is what St. Thomas means by verum. The universe is per se intelligible, ordered by its nature to being known. Everything, to quote St. Thomas in the Summa, is knowable insofar as it is in act. And so intelligibility itself is based on the effects that a thing has on the world, which contains an internal logic open to being understood by a knowing mind. It is in and of itself knowable. And so this quality of existence Thomas calls verum, truth. Here again, we can return to a similar thought experiment that he used with action, and let us try now to imagine a being that is totally unknowable. We tried before to imagine a being totally inactive. Let's try to imagine one totally unknowable. Okay, well, it can't be known by sight, it can't be known by touch, it can't be accessed by reason. It's totally in and of itself unknowable. And once again, this being looks an awful lot like non-being. It looks an awful lot like nothingness. So that's one way to reach that conclusion. But what's more, there's an experiential ground level by which we can know this. All of us have likely experienced the profound satisfaction and wonder of having really come to know something. Ontological truth is the object of the human intellect. Vero entis ad intellectum exprimit hoc nomen verum. And this mutual orientation of mind to being and being to mind, St. Thomas calls verum, the truth, which is naturally a property of being itself. All real beings are so far active, one, and true. They reflect the divine rationality of the Creator's mind. Put simply, intelligence and intelligibility fit together like puzzle pieces, producing delight when they meet. Thus, every real being may be rightly called true. The fourth transcendental, goodness, is especially relevant to our contemplation of beauty. As truth describes the orientation of being to intellect, to a knowing mind, goodness satisfies the will or appetite. Bonum est quo omnia appetunt. The good is that which all things desire. St. Thomas writes in De Veritatis. So for St. Thomas, the good is that which perfects, makes fuller. It is intrinsically valuableness, the quality of being appreciable or lovable by some rational appetite. This is what he means by goodness. Goodness as a quality of all real being. Now, here as we get closer to beauty, there are a couple of errors that we would want to avoid when reading the thought of St. Thomas. The first would be to confuse what he calls instrumental goods with intrinsic or ontological goodness. So instrumental goods are precisely what they sound like, goods that are useful as an instrument to achieve some other end. So a good shovel, for example, is good for digging holes, or a good can opener, those sorts of things. Clearly, that kind of goodness cannot apply to all real beings, as mosquitoes and houseflies demonstrate beyond the shadow of a doubt. But intrinsic goodness, now that's the quality of being valuable per se, the quality of a being having intrinsic or ontological appreciableness. This goes beyond our utilitarian evaluations that we might say, okay, that's a good shovel. We observe this though, we can get a hint. When we take that same pesky mosquito or that same housefly, we examine it in a disinterested way, not disinterested as in we aren't interested in it, but disinterested in a way that we're not concerned immediately with how convenient or inconvenient that being is to us personally. When we do that, we can't help but be fascinated by the intricacy and elegance. If you've ever seen a mosquito or a housefly, two of my most hated creatures on the planet, if you've ever seen slides of them, for example, under a microscope, one can't help but, if one is disinterested enough to hold back all memories of mosquito bites or buzzing flies around the kitchen, if you can do that long enough, you can't help but admit that there is a certain intrinsic appreciableness there. And that appreciableness spans not only from the housefly all the way down to the smallest atomic matter, which fascinates physicists, but also all the way up to rational creatures, whom psychologists love to analyze, angels, and perhaps God himself. This is ontological goodness. When she's not biting us, we notice that that mosquito, that creature, is striking and interesting simply by virtue of its being. It is, and that translates into intrinsic goodness, not intrinsic goodness that I can use to get something, but ontological goodness that is common to every real being. And of course, classically, Catholic thinkers would have to affirm that all created things are good. Otherwise, we have the problem of a perfect, good, all-knowing, all-powerful God having created evil. And we'll talk a bit more about evil in just a moment. So that's the first distinction that St. Thomas wants to make. St. Thomas loves distinguishing. A second, perhaps even more crippling mistake would be if we were to interpret St. Thomas as teaching that since the good is that which all things desire, I'm quoting him there, we would make a mistake if we interpreted him as saying goodness is defined by desire, which would render goodness a subjective matter of what everyone happens to be pleased by at the moment. That would lead us to the conclusion that I like this and this is good are equivalent expressions. But common experience and reason both teach us that this cannot be the case, St. Thomas says. It would render all of our language and thought about the good to be disingenuous, wouldn't it? When I say, my father is good, I almost certainly do not mean my father happens to cause me pleasure. In fact, it is often a father's very goodness that prevents him from seeking only to cause pleasure in his children. Furthermore, if we divorce goodness from truth in this way, then it denies the plain reality that creatures have natures, naturae, that are perfected or completed or helped by what is really good for them, not simply what opinion they might have about what will be good for them, but what is really good for them. A deep friendship and methamphetamines both cause a great deal of pleasure, but only one of those is good. objectively good, perfective of the nature of humankind. So we can't confuse St. Thomas's definition of goodness as that which all things desire as defined by desire. A dangerous mistake to make, and hopefully we're able to see now some of the parallels that are going to start emerging in our discussions of beauty, because beauty also can't be that which all beings desire. So goodness as an object of the human will. It's almost, I'm gonna have to put this down for a moment. It's almost as if verum, if truth is the object of the intellect and they fit together that way, then there's another quality of all real beings, goodness, that draws in the human appetite, the human will, and they fit together. This dynamism of the human will, which is met by the intrinsic value, the built-in goodness that extends to all real beings, that's the foundation of the very objectivity of goodness itself. Now, we might try sometimes to deny that objectivity in our minds, but we can't deny it in our lives. Every decision we make is based on a pursuit of the good. When we say this is a good book, or it is good to love all people, or it's good to attend a lecture on St. Thomas Aquinas, we are pointing not to our personal preference, but to something we believe is actually present, and I'm going to just gesticulate that way, present out there in reality. Even the most committed hedonist, those who chase purely pleasure, cannot devote themselves to a doctrine of sheer pleasure, because hedonism itself rests on the objective proposition that pleasure is good. So, I mean, it wouldn't do any good to say that pleasure feels good, because that's a truism. So hedonism, even itself, even the pursuit of pure pleasure, has to rest somewhere on the objective grounds of, well, that is good. So it seems to St. Thomas that there is something standard out there apart from human desire, not defined by human desire, but which meets the desires of rational creatures and satisfies that rational appetite. So, for St. Thomas, the relative order of goodness by which we pursue instrumental goods like a good meal or a good hatchet, that is related, in fact, based on an order of absolute goodness, which ultimately is, of course, a participation in the plenitude of God's infinite perfection. I sometimes tell my students that God is the 100 on the test. God is, for St. Thomas, the objective standard by which all other evaluations make sense. Apart from him, I could tell you got a 3,462 on a paper. That wouldn't make much sense if you didn't know the maximum perfection, the fullness of goodness that you could possibly get. So for St. Thomas, that plenitude of infinite goodness is none other than God himself. And so St. Thomas understands all creation as a reflective. He uses that word referring to God as light and creation as reflective of the light. God is the creator whose infinite splendors are reflected in created beings, from hamburgers to opera singers. So the things which we consider the very most beautiful, even down to the smallest, are all encompassed in this transcendental of beauty. Okay, all right, so having surveyed St. Thomas's doctrine of the transcendentia, we're now prepared to study his insights on beauty and consider what it would mean to name beauty among the transcendentals. I must remind us here that St. Thomas Aquinas does not have a systematic treatise on aesthetics, and while it seems that he may have had the opportunity, he did not explicitly name beauty among the transcendentia. So, but before you all get up and rush home, let me assure you that prominent Thomists, Jacques Maritain, Umberto Eco, W. Norris Clark, Jan Erikson, and others have all found within the works of St. Thomas a solid, reliable theory of aesthetics, which Jan Erikson calls, quote, implicit but certain in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. My objective tonight here is not necessarily to weigh in on a paper-thin academic debate among Thomists who know St. Thomas from back to front probably better than I do, but to compile for us some of St. Thomas's thoughts about beauty and to explain how these doctrines can illustrate our understanding of the cosmos of the beautiful. So that's what I hope to do here in the time we have left. In his Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas defines beauty as id quod visum placet, that which, when contemplated, gives delight. Now, like most of Aquinas' definitions, this one is succinct, but profound. The visum translates to seen in the broadest sense of a direct intuitive perception. This, for St. Thomas, is an intellectual process. So beauty appeals to the intellect. However, id quod visum placet, that which, when contemplated, pleases. The placet, the pleasingness of beauty, supplies an object of the will too. So while the other relational aspects of truth and goodness, coextensive with all of being, have appealed to the intellect and the will respectively, beauty, Aquinas tells us, relates to both the intellect and the will simultaneously. The delight produced by beauty is not one of possession, is not one that can be grasped and internalized and owned and subjected to our own devices, but one of contemplation. It's a reflection on the existential splendor of being as such. So again, we must avoid reading subjectivity into St. Thomas's definition. Beauty is not for him in the eye of the beholder. That platitude, attributed to various authors throughout the history of philosophy, has perhaps done more damage by sheer rhetorical force than logical argument could ever hope to achieve. Now, this point is worth pausing over again here. Is a thing beautiful because it pleases, or does it please because it's beautiful? Like goodness, St. Thomas's definition of beauty is understood, as he says, per posterioria, or roughly translated, by its proper effect. So when he defines beauty as that which, when contemplated, gives pleasure, he isn't saying that beauty is whatever one contemplates and gains pleasure from. What he's saying is, by the effect, we can understand the nature of a cause. When we see people experiencing pleasure in the contemplation of beauty, we can reasonably understand a bit of beauty itself. So all he's doing there is reasoning per posterioria, or after the fact, or by the effect that it has. He's not subjecting beauty to the whims of whatever you happen to think is beautiful. He does hold an objectivity to it. Aquinas considers beauty as an objective quality of being that makes itself known by the delight produced when we know it. There are some ubiquitous replies to this understanding of beauty that we probably want to deal with briefly here. The first one really is, well, why then do people differ? I have heard Bach and I was unimpressed. AC/DC is much more appealing to me. Well, an entire defense of the medieval aesthetic of objectivity is probably beyond our scope here tonight. It'll have to satisfy to review two of the classical scholastic replies to the variants and opinions about the beautiful. So how do we explain the variants in opinions? Why, as a lady told me once, why are some people able to watch the Mona Lisa and absolutely be unmoved? How is that possible? Beauty is so objective. Well, first, there's human limitation. Imperfections in development can dim perceptions of beauty. This is what embodies the 5-year-old to sneer at the perfectly grilled salmon fillet and say, I want chicken nuggets instead. Now, these imperfections, hopefully, can be educated, which is why universities, I don't know what the curriculum is like here, but universities used to offer classes in art and music appreciation. Whether those were successful or not, I'll let the students decide. Additionally, of course, second reply to this objection, well, what about the variance in opinion? Additionally, well, personal preference allows some people to appreciate the goodness in certain things more viscerally than in others. So thus, I might recognize that Bach is probably superior to AC/DC, and yet when it comes time to crank up the volume in the morning, it may be AC/DC that I am turning on. That's a personal preference, and it presents no problem for Aquinas' metaphysical philosophy, so long as we don't trot out the old non sequitur of, well, there's variation, so therefore there must be no objective truth at all. That's simply a danger that we must avoid. Variations in perceptions are due to both personal preference and perhaps human imperfections to see the beautiful. We'll revisit that last point just a bit in the very conclusion. Back to St. Thomas. A thing is beautiful, Thomas writes in De Veritatis, insofar as it is proportioned, modificatum, proportioned, and specified, specificatum, in itself. That deserves some careful review. Let me read it without the Latin just so that we can all take it in. A thing is beautiful insofar as it is proportioned and specified in itself. The word for proportioned here, modificatum, fascinating Latin word. It's challenging to translate. Etymologically, it is related to regulation, limit, measurement, or even in some sources, melody. What about specificatum? Specified. Well, that indicates a particularity or specificity of a thing, especially in its form, the form that it takes. Okay, so we've got this rule, this measurement, this standard, this rhythm, if we can get poetic with translating Thomas. And then we've got specification, this clarity of kind, this clearness of form that we can enjoy. So I'll read that quote from Aquinas just one more time. A thing is beautiful insofar as it is proportioned and specified in itself. But how can a being be proportioned and specified in itself, in se? Well, a classic passage from the Summa, so we're going to jump up to the Summa from De Veritatis, reveals Aquinas' thoughts on the essence of beauty, and he names here 3 things that are required for the beautiful. So let's review these. The first, integritas, often translated as completeness. Probably see the word integrity there, or unity. This is different from the singularity, the unity of being that was alluded to in that second transcendental. This indicates a kind of thoroughness of being. It's sort of that sentiment, everything that ought to be there is there. It's sort of the first element of beauty. Integritas can be seen by the botanist who is pleased by the fullness of her plants. The medical student who marvels at the plenitude of the human body in his anatomy class. Or the profound, inexpressible satisfaction of a mother who finally sees her child born in her arms with all that the baby needs intact. It's there, it's present, it's integritas. Neither must integritas be reserved for physical material things, as a complete shape or an integral soul is experienced also as beautiful. Hence, of course, that's the classical Greek notion that the circle was the perfect shape, as it was totally integral, totally complete, without beginning or end. The second element that St. Thomas names for us is consonantia, which is another word in Latin difficult to translate. It describes a certain appropriateness of fitting together, proportionality. Often it's translated as harmony. Many of us can see the similarity there between consonantia and the word consonance, a sort of going togetherness. This is a second element of beauty. So a musical analogy is very fruitful here, because every musician knows by experience that certain elements simply go together. It's not as if there's anything in C sharp or allegro or fortissimo that could be labeled as per se good or bad in and of itself. No, not when considered alone. But when paired with other notes or other tempos or other volumes, beauty starts to emerge, a certain symmetry, a certain rhythm, a certain harmony. Things go together, and when present simultaneously, that going togetherness, that consonantia, strikes us as beautiful and satisfies us deeply. By analogy, the most eminently logical language of harmony is even used by Aquinas to describe the hierarchies of angels themselves, which he calls choirs of angels. And this even ascends to God himself, who is not seated alone in static solitude, but harmoniously relates to himself in the 3 persons of the Trinity, which are perfectly consonant with one another, for St. Thomas. Finally, claritas, clarity. This indicates a kind of a radiance, a splendor, a standing out of nothingness that strikes us in and of itself. It refers to the effectiveness of a being's self-manifestation. its existential meaningfulness, if you will, to move both the intellect and the will at the same time towards delight. Now, describing this aspect of beauty is not easy, as we most often resort to metaphor or awestruck silence in the fullness of its presence. And this can be difficult to analyze. But it is common to human experience. It's the reverence with which the sailor looks out upon the sea, or the stunning tranquility of a long silent prayer, or even, perhaps, the wonder of philosophical discovery when an idea is finally grasped in all of its unclouded lucidity. St. Thomas Aquinas describes this splendor forme with metaphors of light, speaking of God as ipsa lux, pure light, and creation as, again, its reflected light. So God, in Aquinas' philosophy, is being itself, pure, unlimited light. Perhaps too dazzling to be beheld directly, cannot be mastered by complete contemplation of finite creatures. His resplendent glory is shined forth by creatures that he makes, such that every being, from an atom, an angel, is a finite instantiation of the infinite beauty of the divine, infinite clarity of God. The beauty of anything, then, consists in how it reveals what it really is, how clearly it manifests its ontology. So to illustrate, I've got to be careful here because I'm not an art critic or an architectural critic by any stretch of the imagination, but let's say we take two church buildings. Let's take the modern cathedrals that have been built since, say, 2019, and compare that to, let's say, the famous cathedral at Chartres. Well, when we contemplate and compare the beauty of the new and the old, those buildings together, what are we doing? Well, that contemplation requires that we ask, what are these buildings? What is the church? What is this reality? We would contemplate then shapes and numerical proportions and the amount of light let in by the number of windows and the tendency to direct one's gaze upward, etc., etc. And this would all be beyond my ken. But then we would conclude, if we followed St. Thomas's philosophy, that the more beautiful building was the one that more clearly, claritas, displayed what the church itself is through the perceptible symbols of architecture. Now, with a proper understanding of St. Thomas's doctrine of the transcendentia, as well as a solid definition from St. Thomas of the beautiful, we must now descend from the heights of contemplating beauty. We have to grapple with the question of evil. How can St. Thomas possibly affirm that everything in existence not only is good, but is also beautiful, when the world contains so much suffering, wickedness, death? Is it not a mockery of those who suffer to insist that in the aftermath of a tsunami, or a cancer diagnosis, or a marital betrayal, that yes, all that exists is truly, objectively beautiful? What answer can Aquinas offer us? Well, one thing is certain. Any philosophy that attempts to deny the presence of evil in the world and its terrible salience throughout human life is quite simply contrary to human experience. And so Aquinas makes no attempt to contest the objective status of evil in the world by working to explain it away as an illusion or a matter of perspective. But, like any good philosopher, St. Thomas begins by defining his terms. What is evil? Actually, we need very little sophistication to discover its definition. Its meaning comes to us in how we express our experience of evil in language. Evil is discussed negatively. It is not good, not desirable, unpleasant, non-perfected. It's the opposite of the good. This is why St. Thomas follows the tradition of the church as it came to him in authors like St. Augustine, by explaining evil not as a positive aspect of being, but as something missing from being, as not a force or substance that can be located, held in the hand, examined in the laboratory, but as something missing from being. We don't look at a blind eye and say, there's the evilness, let's just get him into surgery and take out the evil. No, we say there is a detached cornea or there is scarring on the retina. In other words, we note the way things ought to be, and we describe the lack of order present. Evil, St. Thomas Aquinas reminds us, is, quote, the privation of some due good. It is neither a real being nor a property of real beings, but a deficiency. It's a gap between what is and what ought to be. And it's more than a simple lack, by the way. Nobody mourns that earthworms are blind because they're not naturally ordained to have eyesight. When a baby is born blind, clearly it would be evil. Evil is a felt defect. It's judged according to the nature of what is at hand. And so it's sort of a parasite on being. Father W. Norris Clark says, a lack that depends on some real being, some real thing, some real quality, some real power that ought to be there. So no real being is pure evil, evil per se, because that would be sheer lack and that would be nothing at all. So evil only makes itself present in our lives when some real being like a hurricane or a human instantiates it by embodying disorder. So if evil is not properly real, then why do we experience it so powerfully? Well, several examples from nature can be given of privations that are nonetheless very palpable. Cold does not properly exist, although heat does, but we feel it. Silence, as the absence of sound, does not exist, but we just experienced it for a moment. A hole in the side of a tree is purely negative, but it's noticeable. And of course, the most ancient metaphor for evil is darkness, the lack of light. Darkness isn't a substance. You can't shoot darkness from a gun or spray it from a hose. It's simply the lack of light. So these negative aspects of reality, Aquinas reminds us, do not act in and of themselves. They don't act, but they affect us by their taking away or by their palpable missingness in some real being to which we have become accustomed. So in fact, actually, it's only due to our knowledge of the good that we can perceive evil at all. For where there's no order, disorder is nonsensical. Where there's no pattern, there's no interruption. We need one more final clarification on evil, and St. Thomas is happy to give it to us. And St. Thomas distinguishes two species of evil, natural and volitional. Natural evils belong to some privation of a natural, usually a physical or biological type of good. So droughts, famines, pandemics, birth defects, etc. Those are all natural evils. Volitional or moral evils, those are perverted, disordered, privated actions that are done on purpose by some rational being in contrast to the eternal law. So violence, hatred, murder, those are all moral evils. Those are all things that rational, willing creatures do on purpose. Now, let's talk about evil and beauty together from St. Thomas. For our purposes, as we consider beauty, a full sort of theodicy where we explain the existence of evil in light of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent creator, that escapes the scope of the time that we have left, certainly here. But our question is parallel, because our question is, if all things in existence, of all real beings, are truly good and beautiful, then how do we reconcile these transcendentia with the presence of evil, with the disorder in the world? Because it certainly affects us. If there's a problem of evil, is there not also a problem of ugly? It's clear from our reflections on evil as a privation how St. Thomas can say that all real beings, as beings, are good and beautiful, since evil is a disorder, a lack of that harmony, clarity, and fullness that Aquinas says are the conditions of beauty. It's a lack. Even so, we must immediately recall that the transcendental beauty that Thomas is describing is not purely aesthetic, but ontological. It's the intrinsic beauty of existence itself, not whether this or that being is perceptible by us or pleasing to us at any given moment. The fact that human beings often cannot perceive ontological beauty, not a flaw in existence itself, nor an indication that beauty is not there. This happens because beauty is mediated to us, bodily creatures, through sensible expressions, and we are not infinite. So in the same way that a forest fire or a tsunami is not a problem with fire or water in themselves, our ability to understand the totality of ontological beauty is often obscured by how it relates to us at the moment. That is convenient or inconvenient, relevant or boring, useful to us or useless to us, and etc. Even so, it certainly seems to us that the world would be more beautiful without such things as suffering and death. Or would it? In order to create a finite, limited world with definite natural laws, those laws must remain stable. In other words, God could not be expected to intervene at every moment to prevent all physical evils. I'm about to crash my car and the divine hand sort of steers me into the right. That would require a nearly infinite chain of miracles, divine intervention, which would amount to nothing less than the negation of the laws of nature. In that kind of world, learning, trial and error, certainly, but perhaps even learning itself would look very different, as every problem would be immediately supplied with a divine solution. Now, as any parent knows, providing instant gratification and preventing all difficulties is not the path for raising a child with a beautiful soul. But, okay, God, why not create a world in which no physical evil was even possible? Wouldn't that be a more lovely cosmos? Well, it would certainly be more convenient for us at times. Aquinas points out that a world devoid of physical dangers would also be devoid of courage, patience, discipline, and any other virtue that enables some danger or evil to be overcome. It might be startling for us to see the deer set upon by the tiger, but a world without teeth and claws would mean a world without tigers. All the fascination of the hunt, the liquid grace of the pounce, and many other of nature's most beautiful dynamisms would have to disappear. All right, what of volitional, moral evils, the ones we do on purpose, ones perpetuated by mankind? Most certainly the worst. What about them? Well, a world where all moral evils were prevented would be one without the magnificence of free, rational, self-governing creatures. That's true. There are times when, for each of us, those moments when human cruelty is so visceral, so devastating, that if we were to make a judgment in those moments, we would hasten to eliminate rational choice at the expense of human freedom. But God is not overcome by passions, and he has judged that the value of rational, free, loving creatures is worth creating, even if it opens to us the possibilities of rebellion. To help us understand how the universe might only not survive evil, but might even be beautified by it, let's turn our attention to one of the most brief and yet profound sentences Aquinas ever wrote. When considering in the Summa whether the presence of evil disproves the existence of a good God, St. Thomas simply replies, "This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good." Just as a song is beautified by the changes in volume, or a painting by its interplay of light and shadow, or a speech by use of opposite comparative metaphors, Aquinas, following Augustine, teaches that God has allowed evil because the good made possible thereby is even greater evidence of his infinite goodness. And let's make no mistake, Aquinas is no dualist. As we've seen, good and evil are not substances that intermingle or compete. No, this fallen world, touched by the darkness of sin, is beautified through it by the infinite goodness of God. A mystery. It is a mystery. Now we have arrived at the fullness of the mystery of suffering, the epitome of which surely is the cross of Christ. How could the medievals have adored this instrument of torture, which killed the Son of God in the ultimate act of injustice? At least that's how they perceived it. How could men like Aquinas cherish the cross and even at times seem to delight in it? How could the cross be beautiful? Isn't this the supreme symbol of the grotesqueness of sin? Well, seen from a purely human aesthetic, the answer might be yes, but it is here at the cross where the mystery of suffering takes on a new divine light. To quote St. Thomas again, whoever wishes to live perfectly should do nothing but disdain what Christ disdained on the cross and desire what he desired. For the cross exemplifies every virtue. This revelation is profound for the student of the beautiful. If God is love, and it is his splendor in which all else of the beautiful participates by reflection, then the inner logic of beauty itself is nothing less than love. And this love is not a lofty, distant, highest good that the Platonists would adore. No, this love is one who, seeing the suffering, distance, and sin of his creation, enters into it, bears it up, is pierced by it, and does all this freely, without reserve, even to the point of death. Perhaps too often we imagine a beautiful life to be one that is never threatened by imperfection or marred by suffering, but such an aesthetic can never be Christian, as it cannot contend with the cross, with the Savior, who patiently set aside all worldly delights for the joy set before him, even during a criminal's death. And what of death? Had the cross been a point of ultimate defeat, then the skeptic would probably win. Christianity would be nothing more than a macabre retelling of human cruelty, taking the life of yet another innocent. But the light who came into the world was not hindered by death, passing it by as easily as sunlight pierces darkness. Suffering and death are transformed through the cross and resurrection from shadowy horrors obscuring the light of beauty to the very instrument of the radiant beauty of God. St. Thomas even calls it fitting that Christ's resurrected body retained its scars. He quotes the Venerable Bede on this point in saying, he kept his scars, not from an inability to heal them, but to bear them as an everlasting trophy to his victory. St. Thomas continues, the scars that remained in Christ's body belong neither to corruption nor to defect, but to greater increase in glory. And a special comeliness will appear in the places scarred by the wounds. Wow. An increase in glory. Special comeliness? This emerges in the place of Christ's wounds, while that place most touched by darkness and historic injustice, the deepest hatreds humanity has to offer, that becomes a special comeliness. Can our crosses be redeemed too, if offered and conjoined to this Redeemer? Dare we call that beautiful? It is. It's a beauty that is probably impossible for most of us to see in the moments when we are submerged in the chaos of suffering, but it can often be seen in our reflection. We glimpse that beauty when the betrayal is overcome and friendship, forgiveness are restored, or when a chronic illness transforms the complacent heart into one that can finally truly love life. Many of the saints describe this vision very clearly, even to the point where they say they love their sufferings. So clear was their sight of the good produced. It would seem then that Aquinas' special comeliness is more than religious triumphalism, but describes the whole of being with Christ himself as its center. So far, we have surveyed the metaphysics of St. Thomas, exploring its incidentals, what it means to exist. We've seen how beauty in its plenitude, harmony, and clarity can be present, and is indeed present in every individual existing creature, exemplified by the beauty of God himself. And of course, we have just tangled with the mystery of evil, both natural and volitional, and witnessed its redemption in the cross. But there's one last thing left for us to consider. That is the beauty of all creation together, of all real beings across space and time, unified and illuminated by the procession from and return to the ultimate source of being. Now, the word universe, many of you probably know, is derived from the Latin universum, meaning turned towards one. St. Thomas's doctrine of creation reflects this, describing God's creative act not simply as a one-time event, but as defining a relationship between God and all other beings. Let's quote again from the Summa. All things are diversified by the participation in being, so as to be more or less perfect, and are caused by the one first being who possesses being most perfectly. That's St. Thomas. In other words, all of the various finite perfections that dazzle us in this world are only borrowers of beauty. They reflect the perfect beauty of God. Creation is not an event in time only, but a relation. This is a journey away from home. Medieval philosophers called it the exitus, the emanation of all things from God, whose infinite perfection is individually reflected in each individual existent being, but also in the entire community of real existing beings, forever joined by their virtue of having a common creator. But even that exitus is harmonized by the journey back home, the reditus. Because finite beings are only limited representations of God's perfections, none of us can find ultimate fulfillment in created things alone. Indeed, for the rational mind, does not satisfy to collect individual truths. It's not as if you collect your 20,000th truth and you go, okay, now I'm satisfied, I don't need to know anything anymore. Or we're also not content to obtain temporary goods. We move from one good to the next, and as soon as we're finished with this good here tonight, we'll move on indubitably to something else that also is good, right? Now, we're not even content to contemplate evanescent beauties, are we? As soon as we have beheld one beautiful thing, we want to move to behold more. We want to see everything, all the way up to infinity. We seem never to be satiated, and that's because we were not created to be satisfied by individual instances of beauty, but all of those, like a beautiful cathedral, are meant to draw our attention upward to the infinite possessor of all perfections. This reunion with the one who satisfies the intellect and the will fully, permanently, this is the reditus, the return. This image, of course, recognizes God as Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, and is not only a claim that individual constituent beings are beautiful, but that their relational consonance with each other and ultimately with God in the light of their creator is the ultimate instantiation of the beautiful. It is a dance. It is melodious. It is, as St. Thomas calls it, circulatio vel recreatio, the great circle of being. Yes, St. Thomas came up with that idea, not the Lion King. This great circle of being is that in which all things return, and I'm quoting him here, all things return as to their end, back to the very place from which they had their origin. What is the purpose in the end of beauty? What is its meaning? As rational creatures, we humans have been granted not only the gift of bare existence, but the gifts of intellect and will to appreciate it. So we do not need a complex aesthetic philosophy to understand how to respond. Only purity of heart. How else could one respond but with gratitude and an outpouring of love and awe for this beauty, this created world that we've been given to appreciate? Should we not respond with complete, total gratitude towards the Creator? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas has taught us much, but I think he would be happy for us to end with an appeal to the authority of the Scriptures. Book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet writes, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has set eternity in the human heart. Yet, no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end." think it's appropriate that we end our discussion there. So I hope now we can take some questions.
Thank you, Mattison.
I think it's where it's on the thing,
Well,
or when,
I don't know the year off the top of my head. That's a great question. Of
okay.
course, he was being canonized by the church, but I don't know the name of the pope.
What's his term, and all